The midnight air swirled in ancient rhythms, a northern gale tunneling its way beneath the motel window. You could smell the snow in the air, and the parking lot was deserted, save for a few cars and an RV that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Sitting at the motel room tables tipping vodka with Sprite was the one Kurt Donald Cobain, private investigator based out of Seattle. He had made his way to Pasco on a tip that a missing person who kept re-emerging, then vanishing again, had checked himself into a crisis center. It was a boy in his late teens who had gone off his psychotropics. The open road had been too tough for the boy, and Kurt had sent him back to Seattle on a Greyhound after a lengthy discussion with his parents on the telephone. Kurt lit another cigarette, the 10 o'clock news just starting on the blaring television. The TV kept the voices at bay, voices he discussed with no one. Although the late 90s were progressive, they weren't that accepting. He wanted to avoid the sanitarium at all costs. He had not fared well under those conditions. Over the blare of the television, he peered through the closed blinds. Slowly, he scanned every inch of the perimeter, following a gut instinct he was being watched. All looked awry, some strange midnight energy seeping in on the heels of a coming storm. He reached for his M1911 Army issue .45 caliber pistol. Suddenly the lights began to flicker, the wind outside starting to growl, plastic bags blowing down the street like Alaskan tumbleweeds. He peered out the window once more, the street lamps flickering like a candle during a eulogy. There was an aura of desperation meets sheer horror in the air, a feeling difficult to describe. Something was surely going to happen that night, but what exactly was unfounded? Suddenly arose a squealing howl from the darkness beyond the parking lot. Looking through the blinds once more, Inspector Cobain spotted a set of ruby-green eyes, prowling in and out of the ditch with the speed and agility of a timber wolf. In an instant, the figure rose onto its hind legs and began to walk with broad-chested stature of a man about 6'5", clad in a cloak with the long saber-tooth-like fangs attached to a facial structure of a snapping turtle. Its feet were structured like a mountain gorilla, with wolf body and human hands and arms, nails on its fingers long and curled into spirals. The being seemed to sense being watched by Kurt, who sat calmly in the motel room chair, gun loaded and hands steady. He had seen his fair share of the shit working undercover narcotics in the late 80s. Almost as soon as it had shown itself, it vanished, returning to the miles of sagebrush beyond the motel parking lot. Shapeshifters, witches, and Kushtakas were all on Kurt's radar. He slept in stints that night, slightly disturbed by the beast which he had seen wandering in the shadows near his Saab 900. Around 5 a.m., when the sun was just beginning to radiate beyond the horizon, he checked out of the motel and hit the road for a 3-hour drive back to Seattle. The parents of the boy had paged him around 10 a.m., but he knew it was nearly a means of thanking him. He had seen into the eyes of the kid, who looked terrified and was more than ready to return home. Kurt pulled in on the marina where his beat-up, watertight sailboat was located. It felt good to breathe in the cold and damp Ballard air. His ex-girlfriend had been tending to his cat, Naomi, while he was away. She was an untrusting feline who he had found astray. It had taken at least a year for her to warm up to him, but when she finally did, the both of them benefited. Kurt was a loner. When not working a case, he referred to isolate. It centered him to spend time in silence, often meditating and using sacred medicine and prayer. Sage, Palo Santo, sweetgrass. He believed in animism. Christianity was a violent religion not suited for seeking out peace of the heart. The Bible was a product to vilify the true goodness of all humankind on every level, be it sexuality, birth, death, or malice. It felt good to be home, winding down with the rain pattering on the roof of the sailboat he had named Gloria. He reached for the grinder and began rolling up a spliff, NPR roaring on the stereo. He had changed into his Pendleton bathrobe after cleaning up and was settling down with a cup of Scottish breakfast tea received in the mail from a pen pal living in Brighton, England. The two had exchanged letters for years. He was reading the paper when a headline caught his eye, reading more like a tabloid, and it stated, "Schizophrenic claims sighting skinwalker at Governor's Olympia mansion." What kind of a headline was this? The media taking a schizo seriously? Reading further, Kurt discovered the man had been a judge for 25 years and had only recently retired, only to fall into psychosis. Kurt took a keen interest in this newfound case, given the spectacle he had witnessed the night prior. He made plans to reach out to a contact he had at the governor's mansion the following morning. Lazily, he put the Garfield telephone's receiver to his ear, scratching at his left eye and coughing. "Hello?" His voice cracked. "Kurt, it's Michelle. Glad you made it home safely. I clipped Naomi's nails for you." Kurt smiled. "Good to hear your voice. I was wondering how she fared with you this trip." Michelle sighed. "It's the most trusting she's been of me to date. You want to meet me for breakfast?" Kurt yawned, scratching the shoulder-length hair and reaching for his Winston's, scanning for something to wear from the clothes scattered all about the floor. "Sure. Roxy's okay?" Michelle replied. "How about 10:30? Kurt lit his cigarette, taking in the sweet perfume of tobacco. "Sounds good." Kurt loaded into the Saab and made it over to Fremont, his body screaming for an Irish coffee. A ritual of him and Michelle's. They fared better as friends than they had as lovers. Endless nights they had spent screaming at each other, sometimes getting physical and overall just utterly toxic. Michelle had spent years turning her life around, finally making it as a teacher. She worked primarily with children on the spectrum. She had a big heart and Kurt adored her, although she wanted to simply remain friends and keep him at a distance, which he respected. It was a platonic nightmare for Kurt, 10 years younger and in the middle of his prime. Even still, he kept his desires to himself in the name of chivalry. "So what's the deal on this Olympia Skinwalker thing?" Michelle stirred her coffee. "The judge wasn't the only one to proclaim what he saw that night. A security guard on the grounds gave an interview to the Times yesterday you must have missed. There have been further sightings through the grapevine, reported by your favorite street rag. Apparently the creature was seen on Eddie Vedder's property, who called 911 and was asked if he was on PCP. Kurt burst out laughing. "Oh, good Lord. So get this, Eddie Vedder has a secret room, like rich guys have to store their precious memorabilia. I worked a case once when I was an official dick. You flicked a switch and slowly a light would come on from inside this glass box, housing a pair of signed Air Jordans. The guy is a sports freak." Lester Yellow Owl had been a groundskeeper at the governor's mansion in Olympia for 15 years. Him and Kurt had not spoken in a better part of a year. They had met at Beth's Cafe in Ballard when Lester was commuting just to try and keep a relationship with some young tail. She soon got fed up with his bullshit, and since she broke it off, Lester had little reason to head up to Seattle, save for watching the Seahawks get annihilated or to catch camp in a Sonics game. Lester was surprised to hear from Kurt, who was 15 years his former. Lester had been caught at home admitting he hadn't made it into work due to heavy drinking the night before. Apparently he too had witnessed the skinwalker. He seemed fearful to divulge any information of the governor's whereabouts during the time of the sighting, apparently citing that the judge wasn't the only one to spot the Kushtaka. Lester had been working late that evening, and while venturing to his truck to put a topper on his flask, he watched the cloaked figure seeming to levitate across the governor's grounds. Long spirals of fingernails hanging at his side, skin almond brown, giant tusks protruding from the face of what he described as a turtle. Kurt knew Lester to be more of a lush than an alcoholic. This was certainly not a hallucination. Kurt inquired further, but Lester cut him short. Kurt sensed there was something going on Lester didn't feel comfortable discussing over the telephone. He asked him if he would like to meet at the Westin the following day. Perhaps paranoid someone or something would be tracking him. Sometimes keeping a low profile meant drinking where you certainly weren't welcome. This much was certain. What could it be that Lester feared strongly enough to drive all the way to Seattle to go putting on the Ritz? Kurt suddenly came to the realization that he might have tapped into the main line, all because of an off-putting newspaper headline he had a gut feeling about. There was something bigger than him or Lester at work, and Kurt began to feel a rise in his blood pressure, sweat beginning to build about his temples. He put the kettle on. Kava tea would soothe his racing mind. He reached for a Winston, taking a long drag, and then staring out across the harbor, the sky gray and immortal. He wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but to turn back now would be a cowardly notion. It was a Wednesday afternoon and the Westin bar was mostly deserted, save for a couple out of Texas wearing matching Longhorn hats and sweatshirts and assorted businessmen from some Midwestern hell going over insurance paperwork. Needless to say, Kurt and Lester stuck out like sore thumbs. The beauty of it was that this was no watering hole to the locals at large. Lester seemed uneasy, scanning the perimeter and squinting through the windows. Kurt spoke up. "So what's the scoop? I'm treading water over here." Lester ran his hands through his unkempt raven black hair, scratching at his face. Finally he spoke. "This whole thing is a lot deeper than you think. And if I told you the truth, you probably wouldn't leave me anyway." Kurt smirked, ashing his cigarette. "I'm going to make this cut and dry. See, the governor, as you know, is Navajo. And I know you know how I feel about Navajos. To get to the point, he's practicing sorcery with an elder from the Navajo Nation. It's been said the governor and the elder shaman have been using their black magic to alter current events, warming up by haranguing moderately famous people about town." Kurt spoke up. "Sunday night I watched the goddamn thing traipsing around a fucking parking lot in Pasco. Why the hell would the Shapeshifter want anything to do with me?" Lester sipped his chocolate Manhattan, Kurt butting out his cigarette and reaching for his soda water and bitters. "The fact that you're sitting here with me right now speaks leagues to the power of the sorcerer. Some proclaim he's a skinwalker over 400 years old. I'm just assuming, but he would have known you would come snooping around sooner or later, and maybe he was trying to scare you off." Kurt was fascinated. "How the hell can you show up to work with all this shit on your conscience?" Lester laughed. "I stayed drunk. I load up on the Valium when I can get it. It's unnerving and quite frankly, I don't know how much more I can take, but I'm trying to put my daughter through school. She's got one more year and then I can happily take a hike." The thought that the encounter with the Kushtaka was premeditated sent chills up his spine. He had seen things in the desert stars, yet nothing earthly had come his way until that Sunday in Pasco. Kurt paid for Lester's drink and the two agreed to meet up for a Sonics game in the near future. Driving home, Kurt's mind raced like greyhounds at the track, rapid cycling and ruminating like a 1,600 horsepower engine, clocking 301 mile per hour rotations around a track of sheer terror. He had forgotten to take his Haldol that morning, and he felt restless and filled with dread. He desperately wanted to go home and just sleep for a month. He had a lot on his plate. Previous night he had awoken caked in sweat after a dream where he found himself getting fed to ravenous pigs by a conductor who looked like Charlie Chaplin. Vivid dreams were not uncommon for the inspector who suffered from severe PTSD after years undercover. He had seen the worst in humanity. When he returned to the boat, he cranked the heat and switched the radio station to King FM for some classical music to soothe his racing mind. Producing a pencil and drafting paper, he began to etch a rough sketch of the Kushtaka from memory, as well as possible reasons for the sighting about town. Could it be that it would get people talking and allow the governor to get some heavy underground activities set into motion under the veil of fear slowly building on Seattle's conscience? Suddenly the phone rang. Kurt put down his Dr. Pepper and picked up the infamous Garfield telephone. "This is Kurt. It's Michelle." She sounded manic. "Jesus Christ, you Luddite. Can you believe what's going on at the zoo?" Kurt was clueless. Obviously not. He replied. Michelle continued. "A cloaked figure matching your description released the gorillas, the penguins, and the wolves. The gorillas are wreaking havoc all over Finney Ridge. They caused a senior citizen to go into cardiac arrest and were spotted eating out of a dumpster in Fremont and reportedly attacked a man on an early morning jog. The beast cracked the man's femur in half. I figured you'd be keeping away from media outlets tonight." Kurt had been quiet, silently smiling inside. It was a beautiful notion. "Christ, I feel like I've been under a rock lately, brain occupied with questions and no answers to be found. This threw the wrench into everything." Michelle calmed down a bit, given Kurt's soft-spoken deadpan delivery, which kept her in love with him no matter how hard he fucked things up. "Thanks for the call, love. I'll look into this in the AM." Kurt awoke the next morning realizing he had slept in over an hour. He tuned the radio to NPR from 98.1, his sleeping station. He put the coffee on, lighting his first smoke of the day. The sweet nectar made him feel alive and at one. He faced north while lighting a smudge and feeling soothed by the scent of white sage, cleaning his mind and opening his heart. Kurt gathered a lot of information from the homeless population, who he deemed more powerful than the world's most advanced supercomputer. He knew Kenny had a spot on Finney Ridge near the zoo, squatting in a derelict old cottage with boarded-up windows and crackheads kept at bay. Kenny was also known in the street community as Pyrex Jones. Kurt decided to pay him a visit. Kenny was the king rat of the neighborhood, and he knew all its happenings and had the resources to gather anything from automatic weapons to hiring hitmen. Kurt stopped at a Shell station on the way to the squat and got a tall piss coffee for himself, taken black, and a 12-pack of Tecate for Kenny. Kurt finally arrived and hollered through the boarded-up window. "Yo, Pyrex, it's Kurt. What's good? I got beers." Kenny was a tweaker in his abode filled with a plethora of what most people would call garbage. Barbie dolls, car parts wrapped in newspaper, Gatorade bottles filled with sand of different shades, a dead snake and scorpion stuffed into an unopened and ancient-looking bottle of rice wine. Kenny was in the middle of an episode of Bob Ross on PBS. He sat with a light bulb at his side, pupils dilated like saucers. Kurt pulled out his micro-cassette recorder, setting it between them on the blemished card table. Kenny reached for a beer, setting several in the mini-fridge. "So what's the word on the street up here? I have a personal investment in the Skinwalker talk." Kenny's eyes shifted toward the door. "Kid named Isaac works at the zoo. Comes by looking to score some of my mushroom taffy once a week. Saw him yesterday. Had some scary shit to reveal. Apparently he was in the room when the investigators were reviewing the security footage. Kid says Skinwalker can't be seen on film. Said all you can see is the glass breaking and bolts unscrewing themselves from walls, doors flying open and a surge of violent bouts, followed by the animals making their way out of the zoo. Clayton, who stays on the road, told me he saw the beast as he was on a drunk, and he's been on a drunk ever since. He's even sleeping in stints during the day, terrified the Skinwalker is going to emerge again." Kurt was perplexed, trying to wrap his brain around all of the events. What of the judge? He had seen the beast. His word had gone straight into the paper, albeit under the premise he was a schizo. Journalists can be cruel. Surely Kurt thought he'd get inside the judge's head before going through with asking Green Beret Lester, with 2 tours in Vietnam, to wiretap the governor. Kurt needed to research the Skinwalker and recalled a book from '68 published on the supernatural of the Four Corners. The book was considered pulp by most, and he knew it to be gathering dust at the Ballard Library. It was titled Hauntings in Canyonland. Kurt made his way over to the library, mind drifting into strange pockets. He arrived and was happy to see the book was not checked out. Curiously, he looked to see who the last person was to check out the book. The name took his breath away, heart skipping a beat. The name read Alice Keenan, a.k.a. Lester's ex-girlfriend from New York City. What was it that had driven her to pick up this particular book? Was it chance curiosity, or was there another motive at work? A bone-chilling revelation shot up Kurt's spine. Although she had been living in Ballard, she had gotten a job as a housekeeper at the mansion through Lester, and had relocated to finish her schooling at Evergreen. It had been over a year since the book had been checked out by Alice, and Lester claimed he rarely saw her on the job site, with his duties mostly taking place outside. Could it be that Lester had shared with her about shapeshifters? Kurt knew Lester not to speak of native medicine quite so easily, but who knows what he would be telling an attractive young white girl to keep him warm in his bed at night. So what came next? Where did this rabbit hole go? Kurt was restless. He took a seat at the table, setting his notebook to the side. He spent the next couple of hours gathering information from the book. He came to learn that skinwalkers are not as solitary as one would think. In fact, in Navajo country, they were known to be couples, and there were areas on the Navajo Nation's reservation system avoided by people relentlessly. Caves where some said from the back roads you could see countless layers of eyes, some appearing to be crouched as wolves, where others stood tall and menacing. They are said to grind human bones and add poison to them. Kurt learned further they could run faster than any car. He regretted not having bought the book years ago, ever thinking he would be this in the middle of it, facts and theories bouncing about like a pinball machine. Upon his return to the boat, he found his answering machine chock full of messages from concerned family members to pompous Eastsiders inquiring over stolen Babe Ruth memorabilia. He made plans to check in with the clients in the morning over coffee. Naomi was happy to see him, and he filled her bowl with tuna and changed her litter. She thanked him by crawling into his lap, purring with delight. He had made his own relationship with Naomi, and she with him, ritually curling into a ball and sleeping on top of his head. He was several years divorced, long enough to not feel bitter or sentimental. He simply blocked out most of the memories he had living on Capitol Hill in what used to be a burlesque hall. Naomi had wandered into his life, and that was the only relationship Kurt was interested in. He had tried dating post-marriage, but everything was forever destined to be short-lived, with Kurt going down in flames. He rolled up a middle-finger-sized spliff of some sun grown from eastern Washington, turning the radio to 98.1, his brain winding down and reading the comics he had missed from the Sunday edition. He ashed his spliff, taking a sip of Red Bush tea. He noticed Michelle hadn't called and wondered if she was doing all right. Looking at his watch, he realized it too late to give her a call. Spending time alone recharged Kurt. People drained him of life with all their needy, greedy affairs, and attempting to dumb down their explanations to who they perceived as a numbskull. Kurt had an IQ of 135, but he dressed like a skater dad straight out of the 60s. Years as a narc had left him with premature graying whiskers and a thinning hairline, not to mention the crow's feet and fingers stained yellow from years of smoking. Luckily, his teeth hadn't fallen out despite the gummies he used to do snorting blow in some Tacoma shithole while undercover. Kurt's eyes felt heavy after butting out his spliff, roach safe for the morning. He stumbled toward the bed, not even bothering to take his shoes off. The sink was full, and the dishes he vowed to take care of in the morning, along with telephone calls. Kurt woke up to pee when he noticed the door in the galley leading outside was open. To his horror, he discovered Naomi's body missing her head, lying on top of the steps. Kurt sat in the quarterdeck silently weeping, Naomi's body wrapped in a beach towel. His heart was crushed. Looking at his watch, the time read 2:30 a.m. Drying his eyes, he made his way to the galley to put on some coffee. As he waited for the water to boil, his mind began to drift, recalling his upbringing in Aberdeen and a neighbor's chickens often found dead and headless in the yard. The work of owls. Owls, he learned from the biologist next door, would only take the head of a chicken as if it were caviar. He had no choice. Now more than ever was it time to contact Creighton Running Bear. Creighton was a Blackfoot out of Montana who had lived in Seattle for 30 years. He was often regarded as a holy man by those in the know. Yet he kept this low on the radar, as to some he was an affirmation of Satan himself. Creighton sat on a council of elders who oversaw the Sundance, a secretive gathering of men not accepting outside interest groups wishing to document sacred ceremony. Creighton loathed the tension, and the only time he spent out of the house was to go to the grocery store or to volunteer his time twice a week at a day center for the homeless Native Americans. He also curated a sweat on a monthly to bi-monthly basis at a tribal lawyer's upscale and secluded property in a quiet Ravenna neighborhood. Feeling in need of refreshing, Kurt took an Irish shower, washing his hair in the sink with bar soap. He decided to have Naomi cremated, her ashes spread on an orchard to become nutrients for the trees, returning to the dust that Mother Earth built us from. When 10 a.m. rolled around, Kurt placed a call to Creighton, who he knew to likely be drinking coffee in his Beacon Hill shack, which was located in an alley. Creighton was close with the Oaxacan family next door. In the backyard, an old-growth yellow cedar towering into mother sky. Creighton answered the phone, sounding spry despite his age. "I know why you're calling, Kurt. What do you say you get a coffee? We get a coffee at the Shell station and sit in the yard. Bring a warm jacket." Kurt felt more at ease with Creighton, seeming to know exactly why he was calling, and divulging no information about the night's events and the strange hauntings engrossing the city. Kurt sat across the table from Creighton, never uncomfortable with the silence between them. Kurt figured Creighton could read his mind anyway. He was so engrossed in visions he found it difficult and exhausting to speak at great length. Isolation was the key. Finally he spoke. "This is for your journey." Kurt took a nervous drag of his cigarette as Creighton reached into his medicine red Woolrich hunting jacket. He produced a leather case. Kurt snapped open the case to reveal 20 silver rounds. These aren't just silver, they contain micro-dustings of sand from an Anasazi canyon, ground coral, blue corn, and salt, bear root. The leather pouch contained the same mixture. To a skinwalker, it was like bear mace. Creighton advised he sprinkled it about the front and rear door of any dwelling. Also included were several lockets containing the medicine, Creighton stating them like garlic to a vampire. The bullets caused the skinwalker to spontaneously combust. The lockets would keep them at bay. Creighton spoke. "Look, I know this scares you, but this alchemy will protect you." Kurt was nervous, more so than he had been in quite some time. There had been numerous rapes and murders of people in high and low places. The sorcerer is sending the skinwalkers to engage in acts of sheer horror. Kurt loaded the items into his military-issue medic bag at his side. It's been said that the sorcerer is only half skinwalker and that he's been alive for 400 years, as you are likely aware. For centuries he has existed under the radar, yet is now engaging in political discourse. Kurt felt clammy, hands in their continual light tremor. His brow was sweating despite the cold, the sun wavering back and forth. He removed his hat, scratching at his split ends. Kurt lit a cigarette, enticed by the smell of Creighton's pipe tobacco. After dropping off Naomi's body at the crematorium, Kurt decided he was overdue for a drink. A one and done at the Tin Hat, grapefruit juice fresh squeezed for a greyhound. Besides, he loved the one-eyed bartender. She was beautiful to Kurt, and she loved to flirt with him, making him feel shy. After his drink, Kurt headed toward the marina, realizing how empty it would feel without Naomi. He might as well have done an e-break Heading back towards Fremont to pick up a bottle at Fred Meyer. Fuck it, the little voice said. He shuffled inside, snagging a bottle of Stoli, some tonic water, fresh limes. He was making this a ceremonial ride toward a certain morning of vomit and a headache which would certainly feel like rats had shit inside of his head. He returned home and went digging in his first collection of cassettes recorded off a Kingston radio station. A box of rare roots reggae traded to him by a client who couldn't afford the last few $100s on his bill. Finally, he located them and his soul felt a little brighter, despite the sadness of losing Naomi. Christ, he thought to himself, he was getting soft, and this was no time for remorse. He decided he would set up a low-key surveillance operation, having remembered from Lester that the sorcerer had an abode at Capitol House Apartments. He would have no problem wiretapping the apartment, but it would take Lester's help to get the juicy bits. He knew Lester would hesitate, but should he agree to tapping the governor's mansion, he would send Lester on an all-expenses-paid vacation to his Molokai condo, which had a full bar, and he was right on the beach. Kurt knew how burned out Lester was. Despite his rough-and-tumble Vietnam veteran twice decorated with the Purple Heart persona, he was a soft creature simply looking for peace. Kurt went digging for his counterfeit police warrants and his narc badge in a special chest he kept out of sight from prying curious eyes. He dug through his closet, pulling out a camel hair suit jacket, a 1970s tie, Van Heusen dress shirt with matching wool slacks, brushing the dust off his Clarks and loading his .45 with bullets from Creighton. He drank more Stoli, and the pain of Naomi was numbed, and the gusto which marked the chase began to reveal itself. Governor Hensley sat and turned the television empty, scotch glass at his side, with a half-full decanter, fast asleep on a Thursday morning. Kurt had made contact with Lester, who was able to get word to Kurt that the sorcerer worked from 8 a.m. till late in the evenings, heading home by 7:15 p.m. This gave Kurt ample time to set up the wiretap. He figured with the current technology he had at his fingertips, he could monitor the bug from Seattle. Lester had set him up with the equipment several years earlier from an FBI shipment stole off of a freight train by hobos who sold it for $500. Kurt knew at some point he would have to turn the case over, but for now he sought revenge. After all, these bastards had killed his cat. Governor Hensley had taken the day off in lieu of fighting with his wife, who headed back to the res with their children. Governor Hensley had left the reservation when he was just a year old, and his parents located to Seattle, where his father found work in the fishing industry, and his mother a job cleaning surgical equipment at a veterans hospital. Despite having spent 99% of his life in Washington, nobody could seem to let it down that he was an Arizona Navajo. He had met his wife at a powwow, and the two had a shotgun wedding. Yet another critique laid out in the press like a pink flag. Early that morning, Lester had arrived and completed the deed of the wiretap, installing several bugs and tapping the phone in the governor's home office, where he and the sorcerer spent most of their time. His wife was turned off by the witch and criticized Governor Hensley as an apple for letting himself be controlled all in the name of not being able to say no to another Indian. Red on the outside, white on the inside. The thing was, she wasn't the only one who felt that way. Lester himself admitted to Kurt he didn't mean a goddamn thing that he was the first native governor in Washington. He was still just a white boy who didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground when it came to his own people. Several days had passed and much had been revealed of the inner workings of both the mansion and the apartment of the sorcerer, legal name Horace Mantooth. Kurt learned that Horace never slept. 24 hours of tape and not one occurrence of sleep was on the radar. What was often frequent and seemingly relentless was the sound of a rattle, particularly at night. Kurt knew it to be a tool to lull one into a trance. It would carry on for a solid hour at times, followed by a match strike and sounds of sage being ignited. Kurt didn't know that Creighton was practicing the same medicine, yet for the occurrence of good rather than evil. Creighton had blocked Horace from invading Kurt's dreams and waking thoughts. The skinwalkers were now at bay, for now it was Kurt who was the hunter. As for the mansion, things didn't start to get active until around 4:30 p.m., when the governor usually made his way home. What Horace was doing at the house Kurt had figured out was taking place in the cellar. Kurt had come to learn that because the election was happening only 6 months away, that the governor was using the skinwalkers as an element of fear. The world had changed since '92, when a ship the size of 3 aircraft carriers was documented hovering above Phoenix, on camera in the hundreds. Despite this, the government denied the existence of alien life, and the occurrence went straight into the back of the American conscience, save for the freak power movement, who knew alien life to be as real as ever, the sightings of the ship ingrained in their minds. Horace would have the governor give an overview of his day, to which he took notes. It seemed a young socialist from South Africa had been working in the tech industry, was trying to get a socialist momentum started in Seattle, and had been blowing up the governor's Olympia office to discuss issues affecting Seattle. Her name was Katrina Tunwas, and the governor and Horace hated her. She was running in the election for governor after an arguably successful term on city council. Her head was full of ideas, including turning the warehouses in Soto into low-income housing. Staying true to his Apple roots, Governor Hensley was a staunch Republican. Since early in his career, he had voted time and time again alongside the good old boys and remained silent on Native American issues. Dick Hensley was despised by the radicals in Indian country nationwide, yet touted as a hero by a slimy few making big moves in the tribal council of the Navajo Nation, known for their compromising decisions. Lester couldn't stand being in his slick presence more than a few minutes. He regarded the governor as a quantified slimeball at large. Mr. Potato Head, he called him, yet further bashing of his identity, brown on the outside, white on the inside. Dick Hensley was a dolt. That much was common knowledge. He had hired the sorcerer after a lobbyist recommended him during a dinner at a speakeasy. Kurt sat in front of his surveillance equipment, headphones on and notebook in hand. Horace was advising the governor on getting clearance to send a shapeshifter to Katrina Chinwatz's home to murder her and harvest her teeth, to add to a special rattle he was working on at home. Such a rattle, he told Dick, would make his second term a piece of cake, and that money and love would fall right into his lap like a stripper drunk and tripping on her heels. Easy, he told Dick, easy as day into night. Kurt got up slowly, taking a deep breath. Katrina had been a client of his at one point, and he needed to warn her. As Dick agreed to her murder on the premise of a surefire re-election, Kurt attached a spare clip of medicine rounds to his belt, just below his shoulder holster. The .45 handed down to him from his father, a Vietnam veteran who came home after years as a prisoner of war, which didn't even break him, volunteering for a second tour and granted one hesitantly by the United States Marines, who kept him in Saigon to carry out clerical work. He met a nurse from Alaska there, and the two had finished their obligations to the U.S. military. They settled in Aberdeen, Kurt's father going into working in the timber industry, and Kurt's mother a Valium-eating day drinker. The two had divorced when Kurt was 12, and it left a sour taste in Kurt's mouth. When he reached 18, he traveled to Olympia and finally Seattle, where he took up a job as a beat cop after performing above average at the academy, catching the attention of one instructor. He only worked a beat for a year before he was promoted to the narcotics division. Katrina lived in Magnolia, criticized by some as she proclaimed to be a woman of the people. Yet those she was trying to champion were from Southside shitholes, filled with families just trying to keep food on the table by any means necessary. With that said, because of her stature, she was a threat to opposing city council members who would never stand to see a person of color advocating for indigenous and civil rights. Whiteness was the ultimate injection needed to set things right in a broken system known as U.S. politics. Governor Dick Hensley held his position, winning the election by a mere cunt hair, and the spells cast by Mr. Horace Mantooth and his skinwalker goons. Kurt got Katrina on the line, and he told her without revealing too much that for the coming weeks she would need to hire security or get a police sanction. He informed her he would be stopping by within the next half hour to sprinkle a mixture of the medicine and lock it for her protection. Creighton had mentioned there would be a time and place for its use, and now is when he decided to utilize it. As soon as she got security involved and automatic light sensor installed, she should be fine. Kurt had further learned that a dog whistle was deafening to skinwalkers, and thus he placed one into the envelope. When he arrived, she was outside smoking, holding a mag light and looking deathly tired. Kurt went about sprinkling the medicine around the edges of her doors and her bed. This to a skinwalker was like water moccasin fangs to human flesh. Kurt's research and Creighton's guidance had him well on his way to getting to the bottom of things. He knew he could never gain access to the mansion as a lowly PI, but he had some tricks up his sleeve. He would meet with his old friend from ballistics, who worked with him in the late 80s on patrol. Two of them were close yet had not gotten together in ages. He knew David Nielsen to be trustworthy. Even more so, he knew him to be an explosive expert. It was not the intent of Kurt to harm the governor. He now merely sought to terminate the skinwalkers being used to control an election that would be a shoo-in for the councilwoman Tenwas to take over as governor. The papers were having a field day with the slew of murders, rapes, and property damage throughout town. All cases having a similar description of a half-man, half-beast, wreaking havoc and responsible for surefire brutality and previously unknown savagery. David Nielsen lived a quiet life in North Edmonds, working for the FBI Ballistics Division. He was a father to a 10 and 8-year-old, husband of a Harvard graduate who majored as an anthropologist, yet chose to homeschool their children. David was surprised to hear from Kurt, who he had not spoken with in a better part of 5 years. Without divulging much over the wire, he asked David if he was available for lunch at Claire's the following morning, albeit Saturday. Kurt promised it worth his time and to keep it short and sweet. David was hesitant at first, particularly because of the gap in time they had spent away from each other, and also the dirt the two had on each other for dipping into the evidence room cocaine in past years. It was all water under the bridge, and Kurt could care less, but David was a family man. He didn't want his kids or wife to know those details. With Kurt, he was in good hands, yet he couldn't shake the paranoia. Kurt sat calmly at a table facing the door near the exit. The family atmosphere of Claire's put him at ease. Finally, David rolled in, 5 minutes early. He had gained weight, so had Kurt. Kurt smiled at the thought and rose to present his hand to Mr. Nielsen in a confident handshake. "It's good to see you, Mr. Nielsen." David calmed down instantly once in Kurt's presence. "Likewise, Kurt, likewise." Kurt and David were both creatures who didn't like eating while making plans. They were there for the atmosphere and bottomless pits of piss coffee. Besides, Kurt could smoke without smelling alcohol, surefire to lead him down a bad road. This was no time to binge. Kurt came out with the inquiry after a brief 10 minutes, catching up on each other's happenings in the last decade. "David, I invited you here to commission you. I want to commission a hybrid flashbang tear gas canister, compatible with an S-300 38mm revolving gas launcher. There is a vital element to the canisters. I need 5 of them for good measure, and they will need to contain a special mixture of sacred medicine. Naturally, we keep this on the down low. Not even your wife can know. It puts you and your whole family at risk. If we can pull off terminating the skinwalkers, you will feel a hell of a lot better about the safety of your family. There's a vivid panic in the eyes of everyone from Mukilteo down to Olympia. Yet this is the main nerve. Trust me. If you go through with this, I can offer you $10,000. I know you're hurting right now. I can smell a gambling habit all around you." David looked up from the coffee Kurt had been watching him stir for several minutes. He paused, a deafening silence screaming between them. "Fuck it." David held out his right hand for a trusting fist bump. Kurt handed a medicine bottle with the mixture from Creighton in it. 4 ounces per canister should do it. Curiously, David asked, "How did you know about my gambling debt?" Kurt smirked. "A little bird told me. He came in on the wind and whispered in my ear." Not wanting to scare David, he told him sometimes when he was keyed into the universe, he could see into someone's heart and mind through their eyes, skills he had learned from Creighton, who he spoke to no one about. Kurt knew the skinwalkers would come after him before vanishing back to Navajo country as soon as Horace was terminated. Yet no longer was this a game of cat and mouse, for now it had become a legacy of chimp and banana. Kurt's confidence soaring. Yet confidence was where he drew the line, for boastfulness led to ignorance and arrogance led to death. Such was the road of life. Kurt stopped by Michelle's apartment the two shared nearly 10 years prior, carrying flowers and a box of kava tea. Kurt swore by it. She was home and he visited with her until the sun started to fade, knowing it was possible for the skinwalkers to seek their own justice and murder Michelle, who often didn't even lock her door at night. He knew the skinwalkers only deadly at night. He kissed her on the forehead and made his way to his car, feeling the loneliness come upon him in a surging wave of melancholy and suicidal ideation. He realized he had not taken his Haldol or muscle relaxer for his crippled spine. A cocktail of drugs was on the menu. Kurt returned home and made some top ramen for dinner, adding a dash of butter and some soy sauce. As he ate, NPR caught his ear, settling down his soup bowl. Katrina Tinwas was killed in a head-on collision while crossing the Ballard Bridge this afternoon. 4 other drivers were involved in the crash, including an advisor to Governor Hensley, who was said to have not a scratch on him. Officials are looking into the incident after Horace Mantooth, the sole survivor, attempted to flee the scene. So the bastard had duped himself. Kurt knew Katrina's followers to be on his case like savage shorebirds fighting over beached whale meat. It all made Kurt feel like throwing up. He had lost a lot of nerve in the days since going undercover to shut down white supremacist biker gangs, transporting heroin on the blue highways of the American road. He swallowed his grief, saving emotion for another day. He needed to keep a clean mind. He reached for his abalone shell off the red felt with a smudge. He shifted gears, checking the bug he had monitoring Horace's apartment. In the background, he heard a toilet flush. He rewound the Fostex 8-track, selecting track 3, and got the tape rolling. Kurt felt antsy. He poured himself a vodka tonic to soothe his racing mind. Katrina died outside her home, where she had no protection. The morgue would later reveal, unrenounced to Kurt, she was not wearing her amulet at the time of her death. Creighton had warned Kurt about the possibility of those in his circle dying. What didn't add up was why a goon had not carried out the car crash. Horace sat in the interrogation holding room, picking the dirt out of his fingernails, eyes momentarily meeting his own through the one-way glass. He had not an ounce of fear. He knew this lawyer to be slimy as hell, with a million tricks up his sleeve. Besides, should he deem it necessary, he could shapeshift. He was cooperative and had the police convinced he was on the verge of shock, reasoning for trying to flee the scene. Because a witness, however, he opted to take a lie detector test to prove he had zero intention of harming Katrina. The jogger reported to the officials on scene that as soon as the collision occurred, she witnessed Horace laughing like a hyena, clapping and waving his hands in the air. He had struck her dead on in an F-150, demolishing her Polish Fiat 126P. So the bastard had figured out a means of murdering Katrina. The city night soon filled with mourners in the hundreds, smashing out windows, lighting cars on fire, and organizing an Olympia protest at the governor's mansion. Horace did not expect this. Civil unrest was bad enough as it was. To throw in a violent protest was the last thing Kurt could imagine making things right. He knew Horace had an MO of relentlessly trying to keep the governor in power for another term. By that time, the governor would have made enough in backroom deals to afford his own island in the South Pacific. Horace had plans to move to Papua New Guinea. This was the nasty side of politics, the wheeling and dealing behind closed doors, vetoes bought and engaged by slimy NRA specimens of the New World Order, logging company CEOs whining and dining Governor Hensley to make waves in their favor. Hensley was merely a puppet in a puppet show, a talking head, a chameleon with a doctorate in bottled vomit. The heat on the governor and Horace was gruesome enough that the two began loading packed bags into a Suburban at 4 a.m. They were making their way to Gold Bar, a secluded mountain town where the biggest sights and sounds were the hatchery. Hensley owned a cabin in the area. Kurt had sat listening to the two men talk, drinking black coffee and chain-smoking Winstons. His plans had changed. With the two out of town, he bought more time on getting his gas canisters, which David had mentioned would take 2 more days to complete. He felt confident listening to Horace pack a bag while listening to Tejano on the radio. Kurt had eluded him, due in part to Creighton and the medicine he had given. Horace had no idea how fucked he was. Lester sounded hungover on the telephone, annoyed by Kurt's requests. Only one bodyguard had stayed behind to look after the mansion. Kurt instructed Lester to turn up the heat and then slip the morphine into the bodyguard's coffee. Finally, he requested an east-facing window be kept cracked. "You think those cans are going to do more than set off the goddamn smoke alarm?" he continued. "You're a nut, Cobain." Kurt responded dryly, "Runs in the family." Night was falling fast. The bodyguard poured himself a nice tall glass of Basil Hayden and took off his shoes, propping his feet up on the koa wood table. He felt very relaxed. There was an orange fire in the sky as the sun slowly fell beyond the February horizon. Inspector Cobain was cold despite his thick wool coat and many layers. The air kept him alert. Finally, the sun had sank, washing the city in a sea of onyx dreams. Kurt moseyed around the back of the house in coveralls, the canister launcher in a small duffel bag at his side, 45 loaded and hugging him through his shoulder holster. With ease, he shimmied his way into the mansion, following the instructions Lester gave him. He slinked like a cat, his gums told Clark's, allowing for absolute silence. He made his way to the door, listening to the bodyguard snoring. Kurt readied himself, slowly removing the gas launcher. Quietly, he opened the door to the cellar, the stairs seeming to carry on forever. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, yet when they did, his heart began to pound. Looking up at him were 4 sets of emerald eyes, a growling in the back of their throats beginning to rise. Not waiting an instant longer, Kurt fired on them, the cans exploding in a flash, followed by an expulsion of gases. He stood just a moment longer, watching them begin to become enveloped in flames, skin and fur ignited and bubbling. Kurt slammed the door. The noise was unearthly, squealing like pigs being burned alive on the spit. Kurt darted for the window, the bodyguard barely able to escape his nod and utterly useless. Kurt made a dash for the van, slowly backing up and making his way toward the highway. Kurt was perplexed as to why only one bodyguard was left on the scene. Had Horace baited him? The only thing he was sure of for now was getting Kenny his van back. He stopped in Tacoma and changed the plates back to Kenny's. The van was immaculate, naturally the work of a freebasing cocaine addict listening to Steely Dan on the stereo. Once home, a story aired on NPR, a 3 a.m. broadcast. Washington State Governor's mansion set ablaze. Authorities suspect leftist militia to be blamed. 4 skeletons of unknown origin discovered in the cellar, along with hybrid tear gas canisters. No suspects as of yet have been found. Kurt knew David was going to shit the bed when he discovered the scale of the event. Kurt finished his cup of kava tea, the classical station playing a cozy sub-volume, heat roaring. He kicked off his Jack Purcells, figuring he had bought himself several hours of sleep. He was smart to rest. Meanwhile, across town, a slight smile came over Creighton's face, put down his rattle, and made his way upstairs to his bed. He slept 2 quick hours before he was awakened by footsteps coming from above. He grabbed the .45 and cautiously made his way toward the door. Suddenly there came a blast, the ship buckling, and water rushing in from the starboard side. Back and forth he bobbed, the water already up to his ankles. He grabbed the micro cassette recorder and made a break for the upper deck. Quickly he dove onto the dock. He scanned the area, seeing nothing out of the ordinary until he looked to the pier stairs, where he saw the emerald eyes burning in the distance like asbestos. The voice hollered, "Eye for an eye, Cobain." Suddenly Kurt's Saab 900 turbo exploded, followed by sinister laughter, the mark of a sheer bottom feeder. Kurt hesitated on using his weapon. The eyes extended a hand through the shadows. "Look behind you, Cobain." Kurt turned around in a mystified gaze, hovering dead silently over the harbor. Larger than several Zeppelins was a UFO. Others on the dock had awoken to the chaos and were scrambling for their camcorders, aghast and leering in fear. Horace screamed once more, "This will all make sense someday, Cobain. It's too bad you can't join me. I like the way you think." Kurt reached for Winston, lighting it and letting out a long exhale, his boat now resting on the harbor floor. He heard Nikolai on the telephone with the police. Suddenly a purple beam of light illuminated Horace from the silent ship hovering above. "This is it. Do you have any closing words for Cobain?" "Yeah, stay out of my fucking dreams. It was never my intention to hurt you, Cobain. I must be going on my way." Suddenly his head altered into a wolf-like structure, legs like a centaur, flashing yellow saber-toothed fangs, long fingernails pointing at Kurt before leering his head straight back and looking upward at the ship, vanishing into the light. Nothing was left in the sky, except for the northern lights, rarely visible that far south. Kurt turned to Nikolai. Firefighters arriving to put out the car fire. "You got any vodka?" Nikolai laughed, asking him to board. Kurt sat with Nikolai, the two of them crocked by dawn. Kurt felt at ease, and Anvil lifted off his shoulders. Finally, Kurt remembered the surveillance equipment at the bottom of the harbor. His valuables were mostly stored in a unit downtown. He was not concerned with the loss of the Gloria. He was perplexed. Why had Horace spared him? Kurt had turned over the microcassettes to FBI agents on the scene, awaiting questioning later that day. The city felt more at ease, the press having a field day with their supernatural events, and long-haired cardigan-wearing, chain-smoking PI with adult acne. Kurt swore not to give any mention of David's involvement. Finally, the rioting came to a halt. Cobain celebrated to such a degree that greedy clam hands Jeff Bezos offered to turn over the keys to his mansion on Whidbey Island, with a hardy acreage to boot. Kurt and Michelle accepted the offer, and as soon as the settlement was on paper, the two began converting the mansion into a retreat for the arts, built solely for low-income youth. The program featured recording studios, drawing and painting instruction, carving, pottery, photography. Anything related to the arts was at the students' fingertips, including therapy. Kurt and Michelle built a small cabin on the acreage as well as a beautiful 50s modern home for Creighton, who was awestruck. What became of Dick Hensley? The FBI didn't have enough dirt on him to put him away. Yet now regarded as a witch, he was not welcome in Navajo country, banished and heartbroken. He relocated his family to Key West, where several years later he died of arsenic poisoning. Attempts to interrogate his wife had failed, as she had taken her and her children to Norway, marrying into a Sami family and given asylum. Interpol claiming they did not have enough on her and chose to stay out of the picture. Michelle won an America Insight Award for a film she made cataloging Kurt and cohorts assembling and opening the Cobain School of the Arts. It was regarded as a mind-altering, impactful, daring film. Kurt, who never expected to live past 30, passed away in his sleep at age 80, just 1 year into the day of Michelle's passing. In lieu of Kurt and Michelle's passing, a controversial sculpture of the two was cast in bronze beneath the yellow cedar in Volunteer Park, of Kurt and Michelle lying next to each other in sleeping bags with a cat between them. The summit was a disgrace to the homeless. To others, it was a sacred space to leave flowers, tobacco, and prayers. The two were buried side by side at Mount Olivet Cemetery, traditionally a graveyard reserved for bodies unclaimed at the Seattle morgue, a cemetery of the homeless built on top of an old dump site. Their headstone was adorned in the following quote, "I was not proud of what I had learned, but I never doubted that it was worth knowing." Hunter S. Thompson, The Rum Diary. Novella by John S. Argetsinger, April 13th, 2021, 5:21 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.